Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Energy News Beat podcast. My name's Stu Turley, President and CEO of the Sandstone Group. I'll tell you, there's a lot of crazy things going around the world right now. And having a world understanding of energy is very important because so many times, as Americans, we just sit here and think, oh, I'm going to go to the store. But having people and discussions from around the world is more important now than it ever has been in the past. And today we're talking with Hugo Kruger, and I have butchered his name up. He is in Paris right now, but we've had a little bit of a chit chat right before we get here. And Hugo, thank you for coming to the podcast. How do you pronounce your name?
Hi, thank you, Stu. So, yeah, I'm South African in origin, and I speak my home language was Afrikaans, so my name is pronounced Hugo Kruger, but Hugo Kruger is fine for people from English-speaking countries. I take no exception to that.
Now that's funny. You were saying also your sister is looking at becoming a Japanese citizen, and that's a new thing. So you're in Paris with your friend, and your wife is Iranian. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. So my family's all over the world, and then my parents still stay in South Africa, and I even had a brother who taught in China at one stage, who taught English there. So it's a mixed international family, I can say that, with
You
roots still
know,
in South Africa.
being Americans, we are so blinder centric that we just don't even look at anything other than the grocery store or the next football game. I mean, we're too stupid. I mean, honestly. And to hear this kind of a family gathering and everything else, you just were on David Blackman's The Energy Question. That was a phenomenal interview as well, too. How did you get started as a South African in taking a look at energy around the world?
Sure. So, I studied civil engineering originally. I was into construction, but my grandfather was an expert in what we call fly ash technology. Now, for those who don't know, where you burn coal, if you pulverize it, you get fly ash. If you don't pulverize, you get what we call clinker ash. Clinker ash you can use in cement brick manufacturing, and fly ash you can use this in addition to cement. So, what used to be known as ordinary Portland cement, OPC, part of that OPC can be replaced by fly ash, right? And it's got many advantages, but one advantage is, for example, is you don't need to, when you build dams, like they did in the Hoover Dam, they put the water into the dam wall. When you
Right.
add fly ash to cement, you don't need to do that, okay? Because the
Yeah.
hydration heat is lower. So coal has that supplement advantage to it. So I always knew something about the coal industry. There's an entire value chain attached to it. And I started working in cement manufacturing myself after graduating, okay, working for a company called Lafarge, which was a French company. Then at the time, when I was studying French, because working for a French company, and our lecturer said, listen, you have scholarships for people who want to go and study in France. So I got a scholarship to study in France. At the time, enrollment closed for cement and materials science, but I had a scholarship already, so I enrolled for a random degree in nuclear engineering, without knowing too much about it because I came from civil background. So it was the construction of nuclear power stations, because this was 2015. And at
Right.
that time, France was rethinking already about their aging nuclear fleet. And
Oh,
what do we
yeah.
do about it? So they had to study and analyze them. So they were first training engineers in construction to realize what the mistakes were before they were going to rebuild and upgrade them, do life extensions. That's how you're supposed to do it.
Right.
So France already started with a program going back as far as I can tell, 2013. I was in one of the first classes enrolled in 2015. Then
Nice.
I started working in Hinkley Point C, on the project in the UK. And the French are always like this. They go and build their mistakes in another person's country. Okay, so they built Hinkley Point C, they built Flamanville, those costs exploded. And now they restarted to say that project isn't going to work. So we're going to do EPR2, and they're going to rebuild 6 to 7 power stations very quickly after analyzing the errors in all their coal fleet, in all their in the nuclear fleet, and just fixing it. Then for about 2 years, I worked at ITER, the International Thermonuclear Reactor, which is a fusion reactor in the south of France in
Right.
Aix-en-Provence. US is also involved in the project, and worked there actually with a lot of American engineers. Then afterwards, I went into the oil and gas industry because the salaries was just higher, frankly.
Right.
And I thought, well, let me learn how they're going to do it because I learned a bit about coal when working in cement. Then I went into
Right.
oil and gas, oil and gas actually, and offshore wind, surprisingly. That's what made me skeptical of offshore wind, is actually working in the sector. Right, because what the engineers and the analysts were saying in the companies and what the media was saying is just miles away from
Right.
how people think how fast you can build it, how people think what they actually cost. Can we do it with or without subsidies? Sometimes we can, sometimes we can't, things of that nature. So I got to learn a little bit of that. I haven't worked in solar yet, but I've got a good sense of it works. So I've worked in many of the major energy sources. And I've actually, when I was working in concrete, worked a bit on dam construction as well in South Africa. So I know it's all energy
Wow.
related, right? So I've got a mixed grid experience, if you can say that, in particular in the construction of these things and how they work. Yeah.
This is huge, and especially because let's go back to France for just a second.
Mm.
Okay, France. I've been reading, and so that's why I love podcasting, is because I get to talk to folks from around the world. France exports so much energy from their nuclear fleet. Are they running only 50% capacity because of maintenance? I've been reading this, that their fleet is down from its capacity because they had not put much money back into the maintenance of their fleet. Is that
Yeah,
true?
that's
Is that
it's part of the reasons. Yes. First of all, when a plant gets older, its efficiency just goes down. Right.
right?
With age, degradation sets in, and then mid-lifetime of any plant, you have to do a life extension. But
Right.
there was a few issues in France when President François Hollande got elected a few years ago. He wanted to win the marginal vote, so he appeased the Greens. Okay, and then Greenpeace told him to make a decision to basically put a target that France will have only 50% nuclear by 2030 or 35 or something like that.
Right.
That decision alone, that pledge, wasn't even a full decision. A pledge alone made Electricity de France fire their engineers, so they couldn't do life extensions. Okay. So it's
Wow.
actually systemic sabotage through policy. Fortunately, the French unions rebelled, okay, and what the French do is they never change their leaders, they change their advisors, and then they show them the guillotine. And basically, they said to Macron, who was elected, because Macron was elected anti-nuclear. Can you believe that? Okay, and pro-Thatcher, which means destroy the nuclear fleet. So they changed all his advisors, and they said to him, if you do not recommit to nuclear, we're
Right.
going to vote you out. Okay. Now he's changed his religion and he's singing along. Okay. And that's how you sort your
Wow.
politicians out. So, anyways, there was a delay basically in France. They canceled their program, they fired the engineers, then they had to retrain them. So, when I was working on Hinkley Point C, it was myself in my 20s, a few people in their 30s, and then people who were about to enter retirement. So, there was a
Right.
skills gap. Anyway, so to answer your long question, yes, it has to do with a delay in maintenance, but the root cause is political. It's not that they
Wow.
didn't want to do it. It is that the politicians prevented them from doing it. Now they are fixing it, but it's going to cost money. So they have to increase the
Wow.
tariff a little bit. And Macron, again, before he won the last election, he didn't want to increase the tariff because it's price, supply, and demand correction, right?
Right.
And then he said we can keep it artificially low. So what does that do? It exploded Electricity de France's debt. Right. So now the taxpayer has to bail out what the politician did to win the election. That's the problem with politics and energy. And the fortunate thing is, I don't see how you can ever eliminate it. Because you look at the US, you guys have the same issue in a different way, right?
Right.
Politicians will always try and go for energy because it's so easy to manipulate prices,
Right.
to win an election. So there were a lot of systemic issues associated with what you're seeing. So it's part true what you said, but it lacks context.
Wow. You know, I read 2 or 3 hours every day on energy around the world, and you don't pick that up unless you sit down and talk to someone around the world. It's not in mainstream media,
No.
uh, and it's like, holy smokes. Now your background, Hugo, is absolutely weird. You actually understand a total view of energy that few people take a look at, because you're not looking at a solar, you're not looking at a wind, you're looking at a total piece of the pie. And when
Mhm.
you're taking a look at coal, King Coal is back. I mean, look,
Yeah.
Germany is now firing their coal plants back up. Where do you see 2024 going with coal around the world right now?
So I've got, I'm going to list you the 7 energy sources in the world. Okay. I
Okay.
think, first of all, many people don't distinguish between energy and electricity. And as you and I
Exactly.
both know, electricity is a subset of energy. Energy is much broader, right?
Right.
Coal has a whole value chain attached to it. Dynamite, for example, is made from coal. Many people won't know that. The cement industry needs coal. The steel industry needs coal. Okay.
Right.
But if you look at the 7 energy sources, let's list them from most green and most environmentally acceptable, to use that word, what would work in California, okay, to that which will not work in California at the bottom. So first is wind and solar at the top, okay? Wind and solar have expanded at mass production. That is true. Wind less than solar, but nonetheless, solar has, because it's easy to put on your rooftop. Rooftop solar has a high added value when it is for the daytime peak. But as soon as it starts penetrating 10 to 15% of the grid, you need to call on the natural gas guys to start ramping up, right? To run their assets more inefficiently. So wind and solar is constrained by the availability of gas, or if you're lucky, hydropower. Not every country in the world has hydropower. Countries with a large river have a large battery, and they're constrained by grid space, because the more wind and solar, the more you have to build out the transmission lines, and that's becoming a political issue in many countries. So to take a neutral stand, wind and solar is expanding, but they're going to be constrained by what I just mentioned. Then, okay, then number 3 on the list is hydropower. We spoke a little bit about it. You need catchment areas. The world has run out of catchment areas. I also worked for a firm designing plants, hydro plants. World has run out of catchment areas. So there isn't more, with a few exceptions maybe in Africa, but it's far away from population centers. Again, transmission line constraints. The average lead time is 10 years, right? It's not going to happen tomorrow. Then pumped storage, which is related to hydropower, also has a 10-year lead time, at least in South Africa. Some countries build it a bit faster, and some countries like the US have excess already, so you can easily integrate wind and solar. Okay, so those are the first three green ones. Then we go to nuclear power. It's green depending on who you ask. But nuclear power in the US is 3 to 5 times the cost of Asian markets. The Chinese and Indians are building at mass production, but volatile has exploded in cost and is politically unacceptable in the United States. The US is the worst political economy when it comes to nuclear. France, given the experiences in Flamanville and Hinkley Point C, has struggled to get costs under control because they overcomplicated the plant construction. So they have to sort out that issue yet. Japan, I saw today, re-added 8 gigawatt of nuclear, right? Nuclear can be swung by public opinion. It happened in South Africa 3 times. So it's a constraint. Whether I'm for or against nuclear is not the argument, is that those are constraints, and public opinion is a constraint. If you have a lot of environmental legislation, it's not going to expand, okay? So what is then more acceptable? Well, oil. Oil has got a big issue, Middle East. My wife's from Iran. Unless Saudi Arabia plays along and they roll out the red carpet to Joe Biden or Xi Jinping, oil will be constrained by what OPEC does, because Saudi Arabia is this big player in the market, right? They can dictate prices. In the US, it's a bit of less of an issue because most of your oil comes from Canada. But it's an issue for the rest of the world because most of the world is not North America, right? Then you say, okay, I've gone through the 6 sources. What is left? Oh, yeah, then you've got LNG, which is more acceptable than oil, you would argue. LNG is constrained by the availability of infrastructure. There's not a single import facility in Africa at the moment. I think Morocco might have finished one now. Africa only exports LNG. We don't import yet. Okay. So we don't even use it for domestic cooking yet. All the stuff you did in the US in the last 10 to 20 years, we haven't done it in Africa yet. That is 4 out of 10 of the world's population. Okay. So we've gone through all of them. What is left? The most available, dirtiest of them all, which is king coal. And that is why I say, like a heretic, okay, I'm not making myself popular saying these things. I do not see a stoppage to the expansion of coal. It might stop at a reduced rate in India or maybe in China now, because China is adding pumped hydro to the rest of scale. But nonetheless, China is upgrading their coal plants. They're not expanding new ones. Many countries, I believe, is going to upgrade their coal plants for another 20 years. And in Africa, Botswana just built a new coal station last year. South Africa is thinking of overhauling the entire coal fleet. We are the most coal-dependent country in the world, and the rest of Africa hasn't even developed yet. So even if you add wind and solar and all the other sources to the mix, unless they can speak to those major constraints, and there are others as well, I do not see why coal will not stop expanding. Simple as that.
Hugo, you have just, in about a 2-minute time period, gave one of the best world energy discussions I've had. Well done. Now, but when we sit back and take a look at nuclear, I'm a nuclear fan. Again, I'm energy agnostic. It's let's get the lowest kilowatt per hour to everyone on the planet. Let's eliminate poverty. And the only way to do that is low cost energy. Why is Africa having to take money from the International Monetary Fund for renewable projects only? Why don't we get them natural gas uh, things and get them all the low cost of their natural resources and help them come along using clean technology. That to me makes more sense.
It makes a lot more sense to us. And there's a few issues with what you just highlighted there. I'll give you an
Okay.
example. The South African president's a man by the name of Cyril Ramaphosa. Okay, Cyril Ramaphosa has a brother-in-law by the name of Patrice Motsepe. He's the third or fourth richest guy in the country, and he
Right.
happens to be the biggest beneficiary of renewable energy. So the country has literally taken out loans to expand transmission infrastructure to basically connect the president brother-in-law, okay, to the grid. I mean, that is
Uh,
daylight corruption in South Africa. We are not alone in this. Mexico's ambassador, so the president the last year was announced as the ambassador for heat for the UN. I don't know what he's going to do, sell heat pumps or air conditioners. It's ridiculous. And what this means is cronyism being entrenched through these policies because they don't make intuitive sense. My view is if you ask me, should North America or Europe build more coal? My answer would be probably no. I don't think they should build anything except maintain the infrastructure because your electricity demand's been more or less stagnant, if not falling.
right.
But should Africa build coal? In the absence of
Absolutely.
anything else, it's a moral argument. Yes, they should. Countries like the DRC, as majority of the population still in fuel poverty, and then John Kerry flies there in his greenhouse gas swimming plane and says to them, "We are all in this together, guys."
No,
Really?
you're not. No.
The problem with this is going to come when the Chinese and the Indians don't seem to care too much about these policies because they understand it because they recently
Right.
developed their societies. They are opening up geopolitical. They're giving away, US and Europe is giving away Africa geopolitically to those countries.
Yes.
So yes, we need wind and solar, and we have lots of those reserves, and we will exploit them. We will not follow the same path that America and Europe follow through only coal,
Right.
but we still will need coal. Okay, so our policy is still directional if you care about decarbonization, but it
Right.
should not impede our expanding because we have different priorities. Two-thirds of all South African men are out of work at the moment. 60-70% of them are black. So by restricting the expansion of coal or just the maintenance of the coal fleet, which is what the World Bank wants South Africa to do, I mean, it's just a callous and racist policy. There's no other way to put it.
Racism is alive and well in energy.
Yeah.
That could almost be a T-shirt, and that makes me earsick. That just makes me puke to think that the world leaders are racist, and I'm
Well, the thing is, they come and they preach and they say it's for the greater good of everyone else. But that is exactly what Cecil John Rhodes and the great colonialists in the beginning of the last century did. They also believed they were spreading the gospel when they killed populations, indigenous populations. Here
right,
we are saying we're going to restrict your energy consumption, or we're just not going to allow you to exploit the resources underneath your feet. And,
right,
and again, I'm not saying a country should expand coal willy-nilly. Most will not, because
right.
solar and wind and nuclear and all these things are now part of the mix. They're part of the tools. Finally, at COP28, the world came around to accept nuclear. Africa's building a new nuclear plant in Egypt. We are
Yes,
going to build a new one in South Africa. We already have one, another one maybe. And
yep.
I suspect Kenya is going to do it. But nuclear has never expanded in a country that is highly poor. It's expanded in countries that are sort of middle income. And
Right.
that's where the base business case at the moment. So I don't see why a country with illiteracy, like Niger, for example, and those countries, 80-90% illiteracy, would be able to expand nuclear. Okay.
Yep.
Because they don't have the technical know-how, however you want to say it. But coal is easy for unskilled labor.
Okay, you bring up a great point. Small modular the pebble bed modular reactor, the small reactors can be made and shipped in. And so
Yeah.
they can be like Copenhagen Atomics is making modular reactors and they're going to be able to ship them around the world. That to me would be a stepping stone for smaller countries to be able to bring in ship in a nuclear reactor and then have local resources build it because you're going to need concrete, you're going to need coal, you're going to need all that, but supplementing it with small SMRs makes a lot of sense, doesn't
It
it?
does. It does. I would just say this with nuclear, generally speaking, it might not be the case for SMRs, yes, because it's difficult to find costs. But generally speaking, with nuclear, the capital expenditure is higher than coal, but the
Right.
operational expenditure is lower. Okay. So you build it for long term to replace coal. I would argue countries must have coal and then nuclear, but SMRs can be an intermediary step or even a leapfrog step. The challenge with SMRs, though, is this.
What's
The
that?
first one is being connected in Russia and China. Okay. The
Yeah,
US is not building any yet until 2028 or 9, which is a pebble bed modular reactor, X energy. Copenhagen Atomics is molten salt reactors. I spoke to some of them. They still need to solve some R&D issues with the salt control process. It can be done, but they say it needs time. It's sometimes more time of money to understand the thing. So I don't believe SMRs are going to scale en masse within this decade. I might be wrong with the Chinese coming in. But that's just sort of a fact. So what do you do for the next 10 years? Okay. Yes, we should
yeah,
prepare ourselves. So my argument's always been this: countries that can afford it, do what Egypt and South Africa is doing now, which is just one or two more nuclear stations, not the entire grid. And then you use that to skill people and use it as a springboard, larger reactors for SMRs to come in online.
I love that. Now, the UAE just fired up theirs. I just interviewed Grace Stanky, the Miss America. How cool is that? We have Miss America running around the world as a nuclear engineer. She just got her degree. And it's providing, I believe, Hugo, forgive me, but I think it's around 20% of
It's a
the
quarter, yeah, 25%.
25% of their power on one nuclear reactor. That's cool. And
Yep.
that is a good example of what you described, Hugo, was a society that's further along in their economic. Here's a nuclear for a base load. That allows you to do so many other things.
That's right. And what's interesting about that reactor is I looked at the costing curves. South
Right,
Korea was building it. So the three countries that are leading the race for nuclear construction at the moment is South Korea, Russia, and China.
right.
And India within their own market, and Japan in spare parts. US and France has unfortunately lost the knees. France might be back again. I hope the US gets back in the game because AP1000 is a good reactor. They just need to learn how to build it properly.
Right.
But what the South Koreans did is very remarkable. So the cost of a nuclear reactor at the bottom of the S curve is about $3,000 per kilowatt or 3 billion per gigawatt. Okay. That is more or less ready to come in. The South Koreans built the first one at 4.5, the first reactor, and then they got off at the fourth reactor. They were building out of the country at the same cost they were building inside of South Korea. That's their first ever reactor in the export market. They outperformed the Russians on that reactor.
Wow.
So South Korea is really the country that's carrying the flagship for the democratic countries. They're better than the Russians at the moment with their first ever reactor.
Wow. Now, Russia, the uranium is a huge issue. When you take a look at the uranium, and looking at who's supplying all of that, besides our political problems with uranium, I mean, we have a huge uranium deposit that our Biden administration just shut down. So, we have an anti-energy policy, but who controls uranium is also going to control where it goes out,
Yeah,
correct?
so uranium, slight disagreement there. Uranium prices crashed after Fukushima because Japan closed so many reactors and they replaced them with gas and now they're restarting them. So prices might go up a little bit. France, for example, had two or three mines in Niger. And then there was a coup d'etat recently. But what they don't tell you is this French Senate wanted to close down some of those mines because they were an economic burden on the French fiscus. And the reason France kept them there is because Niger is such a poor society, there's no other work for the population. So the uranium price is so low, it's questionable if countries should even exploit because you just buy it on a market. But I think what you're referring to there is the processing, the end of the process. So
Right.
there's a consortium in France from many countries, Orano, that does it, and then the Russians. And the Russians control most of that at the moment because most of the reactors in Europe are Russian. But it's easier to revert that process to a European process, or even the US can get into it. The US are talking about restarting that domestically.
Right.
But the question is who's going to pay for it? And it's going to be a taxpayer again. Okay, so do they want to fund it, right? So
Right.
there's a little bit of this politics, but the cost of operating uranium and processing is so tiny. I mean, it's not even a question. It's something like $5 per kilowatt of per megawatt of electricity. It's really remarkably low. So the operational cost of a nuclear plant, once the capital expenditure is paid off, is, in my view, more competitive than wind and solar. For Germany to restart their nuclear reactors would be something like $25 per megawatt hour.
Right.
That can even outperform natural gas under certain conditions. right? So why aren't they doing it? And the answer is there's a fear of nuclear power. And humans have to overcome this fear. And the Germans have to admit they made a mistake. But that's never going to happen, right? In politics, you never lose face.
But they're taking down wind farms and reopening their coal plants.
Yeah, and the thing about their coal is that people are saying, yes, they are burning less coal. That's true. But what they don't tell you is for a coal plant to operate efficiently,
Right.
it needs to run almost all the time just to recover its cost. It's not a very profitable business to be in. And the problem now is if you run a coal plant only for 2 or 3 days of the year, what happens to your price of electricity? It shoots through the roof. So what are the Germans doing during this Dunkelflaute area of no wind, no sun? They're just saying, well, we're going to impose a low electricity price, or it converts to debt. So the Germans are making the same mistake that the Japanese in the 1970s and 80s made, which was all their bad decisions are being converted to debt. And who's going to pay for the public debt in the future? Well, that's your children. Okay. So yes,
Wow.
they are the coal. People would tell you coal grabs, Europe is burning less coal. That's all true, but it's an economically inefficient usage of the asset. And my biggest critique against this energy transition is this. Um, yeah, okay, fine. You have more wind and solar, but electricity consumption in Europe has been falling since 2005. Okay. And in North America, it's also been stagnating. So who's going to pay for that? You're adding
Right.
all these assets. You cannot recover the cost through electricity. Where's it going to come from? It's going to
Right.
come from public debt. So you have economically inefficient assets at the moment. And Europe has, at the moment, the highest electricity prices, the highest gasoline prices, okay?
Right.
And, some of the highest LNG prices. So somebody in Europe has to ask the question, are we doing something that's economically sane? I don't believe they are.
No. So I got kind of in trouble several years ago. I made a meme of a dog, and the dog is doing this, and I put it in there and it says, "You mean the greener we go, the more fossil fuels we use?" And everything I'm seeing is that was actually a true statement. That meme went nuts. So I mean, I had actually all the numbers I was showing was the more we go greener, quote unquote, renewable energy, the more fossil fuels we use, which was also coal, everything else. And we just need all forms of energy. But your description, Hugo, of using the best methodology is what's missing from all these discussions.
Yeah, it comes down to the cost, right? And maybe we should amp on the issue. There's another issue here, which is how do you price electricity in
Right.
particular? Okay. So at the moment, we sell it in kilowatt hours in the US and North America and many countries. Indonesia and Spain and Netherlands, in my view, have the right model
Right.
where they're saying we have a fixed charge, which you used to call a capacity charge. I think farmers in the US have something similar, and we
Right.
have a variable charge. Because if you buy electricity, whatever your price in kilowatt hours is, usually 10 to 15% is only energy. Now somebody comes and says, I've got a solar panel on my roof. I'm going to offset the entire rate in kilowatt hours.
Right.
In my view, he's not allowed to do that. He should only offset 10 to 20%. Okay.
Right.
Why? Because somebody has to pay for the service to the end connection to the house. So as long as you are grid tied, you should be paying a fixed tariff for the utility to recover its cost. Unless you go fully off grid, then you shouldn't pay it. But very few people can afford a full battery installation in their house, even in Europe and North America. So
Right.
as long as you're tied to the grid, the utility should not be bankrupt. And the state I'm looking at in the US at the moment is California. There's a very interesting thing that recently happened when they just added the service cost to the electricity. And what's happening? A lot of people who put PVs on their homes realize that they have stranded assets. And the reason for this is simple. It makes no sense for me to grow my own food and compete against the Portuguese grocer. Okay. Yes, it feels nice to make your own food and all of that, but let's face it, a grocer is more efficient economically. I have the same feeling about energy. I don't believe I should be generating my own power. Okay. Large companies should be doing it and they should have a market between them. So I'm skeptical against this idea of a distributed grid where everyone is his own producer. I
Right.
think that thing is eventually going to come, to an end when many utilities wake up and add this fixed tariff. And it's coming, and I think it's coming in Texas as well because the price of backup has to be reflected.
Absolutely. And so you bring up some great point. My head's kind of spinning here. And it's the total cost of energy when you take a look at also wind farms. When you drive through West Texas, I mean Texas,
Mm,
to my office in West Texas, there's wind farm after wind farm after wind farm, and there are some of them that are just being abandoned. When you cost out the removal of that wind farm when it hits the end of its life after 8 years. I'm I'm kidding. No, I'm not. Fiscally, without tax subsidies, they're not fiscally sustainable from day one. And so, who takes that out of that farmland? It's about $420,000 just to get the steel and concrete out of the ground.
yeah.
Does that go into the kilowatt per hour at the beginning?
I very much doubt it. I don't believe they are profitable. Even look, onshore wind in Texas might be some of the few places where they might have a business case. But I
Yeah,
know offshore wind in particular, I
that's
don't believe they have a business case in many jurisdictions across the world. The
right.
the ones in France we worked out in the north of France could not have a business case. So eventually, the European government said we'll give you subsidies, and then of course, as a contractor, you'd say we will accept subsidies for those things.
Oh, sure.
Why wouldn't you? You know, it's just my bread and butter. But I don't believe if you cut the subsidies away that many of these things have a business case. And now you ask another question. What if the wind doesn't blow? Okay. What is going to happen now? And then in Texas, you have to start up your gas turbines, right? Because you guys
Right,
are a gas state. Now we run into the same argument we have with a coal. If I have to run a gas turbine for only a few days of the year,
right,
what happens to the cost recovery of the gas price?
right.
It cannot recover its cost. So I have to shoot up the price. And that means the consumer at the end of the day is going to pay for a very expensive battery.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's economically inefficient uses of assets. My view has been this: the price of backup has to fall on the wind producer. He has to pay for that.
And that makes sense because ERCOT is its own grid in Texas. And the balancing authorities through the United States have to sit there and they pay for standby power as
Yeah,
they're going through this. And so, even if it's a energy storage battery sitting there, they get paid to sit there and not deliver energy. And so that is actually the business scam going on these things, is that
exactly.
the only way to make money as a bit battery is to sit there and tie it to the grid so that you get paid not to have battery. I don't get this.
Well, I'll tell you, the issue is this. We have, in the US, we have a price in kilowatt hours where we bid like auctions. Okay.
Right,
Most countries in the world. That made sense in the days of vertically integrated utilities, or when you only had dispatchable plants compete against each other, when you had coal against nuclear. Even then, it didn't make fully sense, but it made some sense, or against gas. But here's the problem. What does natural gas do to your grid? It provides synchronous power, it provides ramping, it provides grid stability, you've got all the other functionalities.
right,
I argue that is a service cost, right?
right.
So my view is that must be priced in fixed terms. People must pay $100 a month for whatever the price in Texas would be. But then the variable price will be much less. It will be 10% or 15% of what it is now in Texas. So your price per kilowatt hour will be less, but you'll have a fixed price. So at the end of the month, you still pay the same amount. It's just the structuring of the thing is different. And
Hmm.
then what would happen is the wind and solar guys can still compete in an auction, but they'd be competing for much fewer dollars per kilowatt hour. And that is the market correction that is necessary. It's a regulatory failure, I've argued. So I argue the regulator hasn't woken up yet. And the regulator that's woken up, strangely enough, I didn't expect it, is California, because they had to add this fixed tariff to recover the cost of utility. So the price of backup, the price of sync power, the price of the grid, the price to guarantee an end service to your house should be a fixed tariff. And then you'll have a variable market associated with that. And when you do that, I suspect the market will be much more in correction and we will end the debate because then we have the correct incentive structure for them to still make a competition. And what I suspect is during the day and at night, wind will have
Right.
a business case and solar will have one, but they'd be far less competitive than they look at the moment because the backup is not priced correctly into the market, into the model.
Oh, man, you brought up some great points, but let me throw this at. I'm sorry. This is a great conversation. I'm getting excited because you sit back and take a look. California is twice as expensive as Texas. And it's, you said that they may have just broken into that new realm of pricing, getting it fixed, but the consumer is going to pay for it because they have now extended, is it Diablo Canyon to
Yeah.
80 years. So they've now got a reactor that's going to last up to 80 or even longer. And it's 10%, I think, of their power. They'd be dead meat without that.
Yeah, but you see, under the current pricing model before the reform California, Diablo Canyon is probably losing money. I wouldn't be surprised. Because why? The wind guys can auction,
uh,
right? And they're auctioning zero, and then they switch off and on. Diablo can't switch off and on. That's an issue. But Diablo provides baseload and stability, and it's not being paid for that through the current pricing model.
no, it's
So,
not.
so my view is the service that Diablo provides is a fixed price. The electricity is not all that it provides. It provides a stability and a service. And that the regulator in California got it by accident. They got the right answer. That is my belief. And I explain to people like a cell phone. Okay, so I started my career also in cell phones, by the way. It's my first 6 months job, very short career.
Right,
And when you have a cell phone, you
right,
pay a fixed tariff and you have a variable price for data, right? So
right,
whether I phone my mom 5 or 6 or 10 times a month, it doesn't matter. It's a fixed price. And data, I really have to draw a lot of data before it becomes a problem in most countries in the world. Why
right,
is it priced that way? Because there's a cell phone tower that's on all the time, right?
right,
And when lightning hits that cell phone tower, what happens? There's guys with a pickup truck and a diesel generator running because they don't want to lose all those people. So the fixed tariff is determined by your worst case scenario, the price of emergency fuel. And what is the price of emergency fuel? What is emergency fuel in the electrical system? It's the price of natural gas in the US, or
right,
coal in Germany, 2 days of a day we work coal, or coal in South Africa, depends on jurisdiction. So in other words, your battery price should be your fixed tariff. And that is what we're not pricing right at the moment. And I believe if you have that reform, you'd fix the incentive structure, and then you would not see data centers leaving California anymore because people would say it just makes no business sense. Probably many of the solar panels on the roof would be stranded assets, or they would pay themselves back in 10 to 20 years or 20
right.
to 30 years. And then you'll be like, okay, should I get something that pays back in 20 years? Then the business sense comes into proportion. But for a large company, it might still make sense to have solar panels because I do believe they have a business case. I just think that we're not playing it right because they should not be allowed to drive the utility into bankruptcy. And currently they're doing it
No,
because the utility is still providing a service.
I think corruption, we come back to corruption is why
Mm.
these regulations are not being changed, if you want my honest opinion, because who's making the money?
Yeah, I mean, in South Africa, the renewable industry is resisting these reforms. I know people from Eskom, our nationalized utility, who say to them, look, we are incurring a loss every year. The government's giving us debt extensions.
Right,
This cannot go on, or we will sink the national fiscus. South Africa is going to run bankrupt if they don't have the reform. Every year, all these renewable guys say to them, we totally agree with you.
wow,
Totally agree in principle, everything. And what happens then? When the regulator has to make the reform, there's a public outcry, there's a media attack, they're killing the solar and wind industry, etc., etc.
right.
And eventually we will run out of money. South Africa is close to a fiscal cliff at the moment. California is running out of money. And it's usually when people run out of money when reality sets in. And I reckon what happened in California recently is what's it saying, when what California leads, America follows? I reckon something like that is going to happen at the moment. Okay. And it's interesting that the green states are figuring it out. I mean, this is not Texas, so it's not fossil fuel industries. They can't blame you and me
Oh,
for corrupting the system.
no, no, I hate it when you're right. And boy, your conversation's making a lot of sense. Wow. I'm sitting here kind of going, oh, Hugo, you're brilliant. And when the Greens get it right, and then we get to pay. Never mind. Okay, I had a
Yeah.
joke. Before we get totally canceled on that. As part of a solution, though, corruption in the U.S., corruption in Africa,
Mm.
and corruption in eliminating poverty is, I think, one of the biggest problems. But how do we, as average citizens, articulate what we just talked about, and what are our next steps? What do you think we can do to help get this word out there to get this under the next step?
Well, the first point is to have conversations like this and for people to recognize the issue is systemic. This is my view. It makes no sense, as we say, the public debt is exploding and apparently electricity is getting cheaper, right? There's a difference. And my view is just we need to recognize first the system has got issues with it attached to it. And
Right.
any system in energy, unfortunately, is prone for cronyism and corruption and things because of the large sum of money. And I would add even the oil and gas industry, even the nuclear industry, there are no exceptions to corruption. Okay. We try and eliminate it as much as possible. And the
Right.
way to eliminate corruption, I mean, there are various ways. It is generally to argue for rules that will make it less likely for middlemen to climb in and pretend to be entrepreneurs of a government subsidy. You know, all those things you and I do. So I would say eliminate the subsidies as far as possible. Okay.
Right.
Or if you have a country like South Africa with a nationalized utility, that's fine. It can work, but then it needs to be structured well. We currently have a problem where our Minister of Energy can determine subcontractors for a nationalized utility. Okay. That's obviously going to result in corruption. So, you know, systems like this, we need to, there's obvious red flags in systems. And I think also if we learn from different countries what not to do, it's sometimes a good it's sometimes a good strategy. If you just avoid all the red herrings, you know, all the red flags, you'd be fine.
Well, I'll tell you what, Hugo, I cannot wait. I'd love to have you back again on the podcast. This felt like about 3 minutes to me because of your knowledge in this conversation. How do people find you on your Substack? I'll have it in the link, but how do you pronounce your own Substack?
So the Substack to the US audience is Hugo's newsletter, but it should be Hugo's newsletter too, if you speak the other languages. And then I've got a small channel on YouTube as well, where I do interviews like this, go usually in depth on energy stuff, other topics as well.
Okay.
And, you know, I write on geopolitics as well, Middle East, because my wife's Iranian. I know that country very well. And, you know, things of that nature. I've done a lot of interesting research on interesting topics of this nature.
Well, fantastic. Well, thank you so much for stopping by the Energy Newsbeat podcast. My name's Stu Turley and Hugo. We will see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you to listeners.